That evening had been different from the start, a thick undercurrent thrumming through our usual banter. Maybe it was the way we sat a little closer, shoulders touching as we sprawled on his old couch with mismatched pillows, or maybe it was the silent language that crackled like static between us. We were celebrating. What exactly, I couldn't remember. Life, perhaps, or the survival of another rough month where both of us felt like we were piecing ourselves together. I met Nate in college during a chaotic freshman week, where the scent of pizza and stale beer had lingered in the dormitory halls like an unwanted guest. We bonded over our shared cynicism of frat parties, and that night, while everyone else howled at the moon with red Solo cups in hand, we were in his tiny room, talking about everything and nothing at once. He became my friend, then my best friend, the one who knew every embarrassing detail and every bad decision I made. The night on that couch, it started innocuously. A movie we had seen 100 times, a bottle of wine he had swiped from his dad's cabinet, and jokes that spiraled from chuckles to fits of laughter. And then silence. Not the comfortable silence we were used to, but something taut. His hand, which had been resting by his knee, moved. I felt the warmth of his fingers as they traced a line over mine. My breath caught, a hitch so small it was almost imperceptible, but he noticed. His eyes flicked to me, a question buried within them. I didn't think. Thinking would have torn down the fragile scaffold of what was happening. So I leaned in, our faces so close that I could see the way his pupils dilated. When we kissed, it was tentative at first, like we were testing the strength of this bridge we were building over the safe, well-trodden territory of our friendship. But the hesitation melted, and the room seemed to spin, not from the wine, but from the way it felt to touch him like this. The night blurred into a haze of whispered words, shared breaths, and limbs tangled like vines. I'd always known he was tall, broad-shouldered, but feeling him close was different. It was intimate in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and daring yourself to jump. When we finally lay there in the dim glow of the moon sneaking through his blinds, our bodies were spent but minds racing. I felt a shift. The world, it seemed, had tilted, and everything familiar felt just a degree off. The morning was quiet. I woke up first, watched him sleep for a few minutes, the early light turning his hair into strands of gold. It was Nate, my Nate, but something had changed irrevocably. He stirred, eyes blinking open, and for a moment, everything was okay. He smiled, a lazy, crooked smile that made my heart clench. But then the silence stretched and twisted between us, and we both reached for our phones, suddenly needing the excuse of distraction. The following days were a strange dance. We acted as though nothing had happened, navigating around each other with the kind of awkward politeness reserved for near strangers. I'd laugh at his jokes, but it didn't sound right. He'd ask me if I wanted to grab takeout, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. The weight of unspoken words grew unbearable. Our friendship, once so easy and light, now felt like a fragile glass bauble balanced on the edge of a shelf. I finally snapped a week later, showing up at his apartment unannounced. He looked surprised, half-dressed in a faded band shirt that still smelled like him. That same warm mix of cedar and something I couldn't name. We sat on that same couch, this time as wary combatants rather than friends. So, are we just going to pretend? I asked, my voice thin but steady. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since college. I don't know what we're doing, he admitted. The honesty cracked something inside me, and I felt tears burn at the edges of my vision. But I wasn't angry, not at him. It was the ache of loss, the realization that we had built a bridge only to find it had no solid ground on the other side. We talked long into the night. There were pauses, confessions, and at one point, a painful silence that seemed to last forever. He told me about the fear, the idea of losing the one person who knew him best. I told him about the fear of wanting more, only to watch it break everything apart. The air between us felt raw, like a wound laid bare. We didn't decide to stop seeing each other, but it happened all the same. Calls became sporadic, messages short and clipped. It was as if a curtain had been drawn, dividing us into before and after. I saw him months later, at a party thrown by mutual friends. He was laughing, a drink in hand, his arm casually draped around a girl I didn't know. The sight sent a pang through me, but I forced a smile, lifting my glass in his direction when our eyes met. He nodded, an understanding flickering in his expression. Life went on. I dated, moved cities, found new friends. Nate stayed a fixture of my memory, a story I told myself during quiet nights. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't crossed that line. Would we still be sitting on that couch, laughing at the same old movies? Or would time have pushed us apart anyway, the natural drift of adulthood? Years passed, and one evening, as I was sifting through boxes in my new apartment, I found an old photo of us from that first year of college. We were both grinning, mid-laugh, frozen in a moment of uncomplicated happiness. I ran my finger over the glossy surface, a nostalgic smile tugging at my lips. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with a message from an old contact. "Hey, long time no see. Want to catch up?" And for the first time in years, the thought of seeing him didn't feel like it would break me. Instead, it felt like picking up an old book, one you'd loved but hadn't been ready to read again. I typed back, fingers hesitant, but sure. "Yeah, I'd like that." The winter air cut sharp as daggers, the kind that bit through cloth and settled into the marrow. Eva had chosen this corner cafe because of its closeness to the alley, a spot she knew would be well hidden when the lights dimmed and the city's sighs turned into an insomnia-wrapped silence. The glow of Christmas lights across the street cast warm speckles over the frosted windows, but they couldn't touch the chill inside her. This was the part of town where street lamps hummed like a swarm of insects, their light too frail to touch the slick, cracked pavement. Here, smiles were hard to come by, and most promises came pre-broken. Yet, it was here she had chosen to restart her life, to stitch a patch over the rent fabric of her past. She watched the steam curling up from her coffee, its spirals lazy and defiant, before finally breaking apart. The first day in the city had been a slow tumble of bad decisions layered over one another, each choice landing with a soundless thud that only she could hear. It was the day she met Mira. Mira had appeared on the edge of the city square, a whirlwind in stilettos and a trench coat, half open over glittering sequins. Eva had seen her walking alone, the streetlight painting Myra's face into something almost saintly, but with dark smudges under her eyes that made her seem older. Their paths collided in front of a neon-lit pawn shop when Myra's cigarette, hastily flicked, almost met the hem of Eva's skirt. A startled laugh, followed by a half-sincere apology, and suddenly, Eva wasn't alone anymore. "You're not from here," Mira said without looking at her, head tilted up as if measuring the stars. The city was loud even at night. Engines grumbled, voices tangled in the distance. Eva wanted to deny it, but the truth dripped from her silence. They'd slipped into a fast friendship like strangers clinging to each other in the middle of an earthquake. It was easier than explaining why Eva had come here at all. Mira was brash and jaded, with a smile that cut through the fog of doubt. She smelled like cigarettes and cheap perfume, like freedom masquerading as recklessness. "First day, huh?" Mira had smirked that afternoon when Eva told her about the job she'd found. A dusty library assistant gig that paid in faded bills and the persistent scent of yellowed paper. Mira worked at the edge of respectability herself, selling designer knockoffs out of a crumbling tenement and modeling now and then for cash. Myra's stories were what kept Eva returning to that spot by the cafe each week. Between half-hearted sips of bitter coffee and the soft rumble of city buses, Mira would weave tales so vivid Eva swore she could see the velvet curtains of cabarets she'd never been to and taste the sweat-soaked laughter of dance halls. One night, winter at its meanest, Mira yanked Eva's hand mid-conversation and pulled her through a tangle of fire escapes that led them onto the rooftop of a theater. Below, a carousel with golden horses whirled defiantly despite the cold, spewing tinny notes from its ancient music box. Myra's laughter exploded, sharp and sudden. "This city," she said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, eyes glassy and fierce, "will chew you up and spit you out. But the trick? You spit back harder." Eva watched her, shivering less from the frost and more from the quick thrum of her heartbeat. "Is that what you do?" Mira turned, Her face lit with the oddest expression, half playful, half something more feral. Every damn day. But like any story worth its salt, things changed in increments so tiny they seemed invisible until they crashed down like thunder. Eva's days at the library began to blur, punctuated by casual flirtations from regulars and the daily gossip shared by Rena, the head librarian who always wore mismatched earrings. She'd settled into the predictability, let it comfort her like a worn quilt. Until one evening, Mira didn't show. A week crawled by with silence as its only company, and worry began to gnaw at Eva's thoughts. Her calls met with dead air, and when she walked past Myra's tenement, the usual clamor of voices, sultry jazz, and cheap beer was replaced by the sound of dripping pipes and a baby's wail. She knew better than to ask around, knew that the answers would come tangled in rumors. But worry, like an itch, grew impossible to ignore. When she finally tracked down one of Myra's old haunts, a club so deep into the district, even its neon signs flickered reluctantly, she was met with half-knowing eyes and lips sealed tight as vaults. The bartender, a lean man with a scar that bisected his eyebrow, looked up from drying glasses and sighed. "You looking for trouble, kid?" "I'm looking for my friend," Eva replied, voice steady despite the butterflies kicking up in her chest. The man's eyes, hollow but not unkind, held hers for a beat too long. "Don't. She's gone." "Gone where?" "Gone enough," he said, which wasn't an answer but felt final. Eva walked home that night past the closed shops, past the lamplights that puddled weakly over snow-frosted curbs, past the alleys that whispered with invisible footsteps. The cold stung, sharp as loss. Myra's absence stretched on, turning the days into ghosts, the conversations they had replaying on a loop that Eva wished she could forget. Months passed, and she started to understand what Mira meant about spitting back. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about taking the bite, feeling the bruise, and standing straighter afterward. One afternoon, as Eva sorted a pile of new returns at the library, Rena's voice drifted over. "Somebody's here for you." Eva turned to find Mira, her hair longer, eyes shaded with something unreadable but alive. A hesitation lingered like frost between them before Mira spoke. "Hey, got room for another chapter?" A laugh, startled and full of relief, broke from Eva's lips. The city outside continued its relentless shuffle, indifferent as ever, but something warm sparked to life inside her chest. The city might chew them up again, but for now, she was ready to spit back. Under the dim glow of the cafe lights, Amber sat with her eyes fixed on the swirling foam in her coffee cup. The sounds of clinking cups and hushed conversations filled the room, but it all felt distant, like echoes from another life. Her date, Martin, was late. Typical, she thought, recalling the last message. "On my way, running behind a bit." That had been 30 minutes ago. The waiter's eyes met hers, a fleeting moment of silent pity, before he turned to take another order. Amber felt the weight of that look as if it were tangible. A pang of familiar anxiety washed over her, sharp and unwelcome. It was moments like these when her resolve wavered, wondering if meeting strangers from dating apps was worth it at all. The text chime broke her reverie. It wasn't Martin. "Hey babe, just wanted to remind you of dinner tomorrow night. Can't wait to see you. Love, Mom." She managed a small smile, typing back a quick reassurance. At least someone was looking forward to seeing her. Just as she slipped her phone back into her pocket, a gust of cold air announced Martin's arrival. He was tall, wiry, with an apologetic grin that had likely saved him from the consequences of countless missteps. Amber's irritation ebbed, replaced by reluctant acceptance. "Sorry I'm late," he panted, rubbing his hands together as if to revive himself. "It's freezing out there." Amber shrugged, pulling her lips into a line that hinted at forgiveness. "Let's just order." As the evening unfolded, Martin revealed himself to be exactly the type Amber had grown tired of. He talked a lot, but said little. Tales of high-profile projects at work, people she'd never meet, the Ferrari he swore he'd buy one day. He asked about her job as a freelance illustrator, nodding without truly listening, eyes darting around the cafe as if searching for a more compelling sight. The coffee in front of him remained untouched, his focus pinned more on himself than anything else. "So, what do you like to do for fun?" Amber asked, injecting false enthusiasm. It was a test more than a question. "Oh, I'm all about the gym and the stocks. Gotta keep fit, gotta keep rich," he said, shooting her a conspiratorial wink that made her skin crawl. She nodded, watching him as he leaned back, eyes glittering with the satisfaction of having delivered a good line. That was it, the moment she knew. In the past, Amber might have convinced herself to stick it out, to overlook the bluster for the sake of not being alone. But tonight, the thought of faking laughter at his jokes made her feel heavy. A memory from a year ago surfaced, a date that had ghosted her after their second outing. It had taken her weeks to stop obsessing over what she did wrong. She wouldn't go through that again. The conversation limped on, Martin oblivious to the strained pauses. Finally, when he excused himself to take a call, Amber watched his back as he retreated, coat flaring dramatically behind him. Her phone buzzed again. "Are you okay?" "Just thinking of you, love." It was her sister, Eva. Amber took a breath. "Yeah, I'm okay, but thanks for checking in." When Martin returned, there was a shift. Maybe it was the muted alert on her face. Maybe he sensed the wall between them had thickened. He tossed some cash on the table, more than enough for their drinks, and said, "We should do this again sometime. I'll message you." Amber gave a tight smile. "Yeah, maybe." As she walked home, the cold bit at her cheeks, awakening her senses. The loneliness that clawed at her wasn't new, but tonight it felt different. There was an acceptance she hadn't felt before, an understanding that she was tired of performing, tired of bending herself into someone else's idea of appealing. The streets were washed in orange light, footsteps echoing as she passed shop windows decorated for the holidays. She caught a glimpse of herself, hair tousled, eyes wide and tired but resolute. Maybe she didn't need another person to tell her she was enough. Maybe she was the one who needed convincing. Amber let herself in, locking the door behind her. The small apartment greeted her with familiar quiet. She kicked off her shoes, padding into the living room where her sketch pad sat open on the coffee table, half-finished characters staring back at her, a silent audience waiting for her attention. She drew until the lines blurred, the world narrowing to the drag of pencil on paper, a story unrolling without words, one where she could choose the ending. The mug on the table cooled, forgotten, but she didn't notice. She was lost in a different narrative, one that belonged solely to her, where she could write out the heartbreaks and start again on a clean page. It started with charm. He had a way of glancing up through his dark lashes, a smirk that promised a shared secret. The first night we met, he swept me up in conversation so fast, it felt like we'd known each other for lifetimes. Our laughter laced through stories that ricocheted from childhood dreams to half-spun ambitions. I convinced myself it was serendipity, the kind that made my heart dance a little bit faster. I remember the first time his anger surfaced. It was startling, like the snap of a bone. We'd been together just long enough for me to start leaving clothes at his place. Enough for friends to start using we when talking about us. We were at a party. He joked about something silly, something innocuous, but I'd made a face. One of those playful, exaggerated scowls. The smile fell from his lips like it was never there to begin with. The party faded to background noise as he leaned in, whispered harshly, "You think you're funny, huh?" It was a flicker, a flash of his true self, and then gone. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Days bled into weeks, and his unpredictability became the shadow I learned to navigate. He could be loving, intoxicating even. Dinners where we devoured plates of pasta while trading glances that made my cheeks warm. Nights he'd play old records and sway me around the room. Those moments felt like sunshine breaking through a storm, and I clung to them, counting them like rosary beads whenever the storm raged again. But then there were the nights when he'd come home late, eyes unfocused, mouth curled into a sneer. I would brace myself for the shift. It was a cruel dance. Carefully chosen words that would pierce me in places I didn't know were vulnerable. "Nobody else would put up with you," he'd spit, pacing the small living room, his voice a tight coil of menace. I'd sit, my back pressed so firmly into the couch cushions they left imprints on my skin, willing myself to disappear, to shrink. But even silence wasn't safe. If I didn't respond, he'd prod harder, searching for a reaction until the fight turned into a flurry of broken words and tears. Friends noticed. One by one, they peeled away, wary of the tense air that followed him like an unwanted guest. "We're just worried," Claire said once, her hand lingering too long on my shoulder, eyes too wide with pity. I'd brushed her off, hating how the concern made me feel small, pathetic. He was clever too. When he sensed he'd pushed too far, he'd gather me into his arms, tracing my spine with fingers that knew every ridge, every dip. "I don't know why I do this," he'd whisper, voice cracked, vulnerability glistening like a trap. And I'd forgive him because that raw, frayed part of him looked so much like something I thought I could save. It wasn't the hitting, it never was, not at first. It was the subtle ways he made me doubt myself. The days he'd pick apart my choices, my friends, the way I laughed too loudly or not at all. He'd leave me stranded on an island of self-doubt, watching the waves of his approval come in and recede with no pattern I could predict. The first time he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave purple shadows, I told myself it was the tequila, the stress, anything but him. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, I would replay the arguments like a broken record, trying to catch where it all went wrong. How the sweet boy with a crooked grin turned into the man who slammed doors and punched walls. My breath would come in shallow gulps as I counted the ticks of the old clock in our room, each second a small anchor to reality, until exhaustion pulled me under. But hope, that stubborn flame, still flickered. It was during one of those fragile moments that I realized it wasn't hope for him. It was hope for me. The realization tasted bitter, like admitting a loss. I knew he'd never change, not truly. The glimpses of remorse were as fleeting as a shooting star. Beautiful, but distant. Never something I could hold on to. The last time he raised his hand, it was different. The fear was there, but this time, there was no room for bargaining, no space for doubts. He miscalculated. I wasn't the same anymore. Months of second-guessing, therapy sessions whispered about under my breath, hours on the phone with Claire, apologizing for the ghost of myself she had come to know. Those moments had built something stronger than his fists could break. When I left, it was not in a blaze of defiance, but in the quiet strength of a morning where the light was kinder. I packed with steady hands, shoving clothes into a duffel bag as he snored in the next room, oblivious. I'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times, imagining every word he might throw at me to pull me back. But when he woke to an empty apartment, there would be no words left for him to use. I had finally taken mine back. The days that followed were hazy and hard. The world felt both too loud and eerily quiet. I jumped at shadows, flinched at raised voices and passing cars, but I was free. Claire was there, eyes wet with a relief she didn't bother to hide. There were long nights where I stared at my phone, half expecting it to ring with his number, and a part of me hated how the silence felt like loss. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, full of days where I almost believed the lies he'd planted in me. But one afternoon, with the window open and sunlight brushing across my skin, I laughed at something, genuinely fully, and the sound startled me. I hadn't realized how much of me he'd taken until that moment, or how much more there was to reclaim. The person I found on the other side of that relationship wasn't just the woman I used to be. She was braver, sharper. She knew the value of her voice, how it felt to have it stolen, and how to wield it once she found it again. The scars remained, faint reminders that love should never leave you gasping for air or afraid of the dark. But they were also proof that I survived, that I was so much more than someone who stayed. One Saturday night in early June, the city hummed with a restless, electric energy that buzzed through the narrow streets like an unspoken promise. Mika had spent the day half-heartedly pretending to read by the river, but all she could think about was the itch for something different, something wild enough to break the rhythm she'd fallen into over the past few months. So when her friend Tara texted her, the message was brief and loaded with excitement. Skyline at 9. Let's forget this week happened. The Skyline was one of those rooftop bars with a questionable fire escape and drinks that came in neon colors. It thrived on its own chaotic charm. a mix of pulsating music and a crowd that always teetered on the edge of spontaneity. By the time Mika arrived, Tara was already on her second margarita, perched on a bar stool with a sly grin and eyes scanning the scene for something worth talking about the next morning. "You made it, and you look like trouble," Tara shouted over the bass thumping in the background. Mika smirked, flipping her hair out of her face. "I aim to misbehave," she joked, even as she wondered if she meant it more than she realized. They clinked glasses, and the evening unfolded in a blur of laughter and dancing, the rooftop vibrating beneath their feet as if it shared their adrenaline. It wasn't until later that Mika noticed him. He was leaning against the railing, the city lights casting shadows across his face. He wore confidence like it was a second skin, his gaze sharp yet soft, catching hers with a tilt of amusement. His name, she'd later learn, was Alex, and he had a voice that rolled like a slow river, carrying stories of places Mika had only dreamed of visiting. One conversation turned into two, and before she knew it, they were tucked into a quieter corner of the rooftop, the distance between them evaporating with each shared anecdote. When their laughter finally dissolved into a pause, Alex's fingers brushed hers. It was deliberate, warm, and electric, as though a tiny switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside her. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, eyes searching hers for any hint of doubt. There was none. They stumbled down the fire escape, laughing as they missed steps, the thrill in their veins amplified by the narrowness of the ladder, the city night a blur around them. By the time they reached the street, the air seemed cooler, crisp, and awake. Alex's apartment was in a building that had once been a textile factory, now converted into lofts with raw brick walls and windows that stretched so high it felt like they opened into another world. It smelled faintly of coffee and cedar, and Mika felt a rush of something she couldn't name. It was almost too intimate, too real for a night that was supposed to stay easy. They shared a kiss that carried the warmth from the bar through their skin, and soon, everything between them felt like a series of wordless confessions. The night collapsed around them, leaving only the whisper of sheets and the sound of their breathing to mark the hours. In the silvery pre-dawn light, Mika lay awake, tracing her fingers along the edge of the blanket. Alex was asleep, one arm draped over his eyes. She studied the curve of his lips, the way his chest rose and fell, feeling that strange, hollow excitement settle in her bones. It was the rush before the question. What now? Mika slipped out of bed, gathering her clothes with the careful silence of someone who didn't want to wake the world. The hardwood floor creaked underfoot, and for a moment, Alex stirred. She held her breath, watching as he turned to his side, sighing into his dreams. The door clicked behind her as she left, the city streets still half asleep and glistening with the sheen of the night's rain. The walk back to her apartment was longer than she remembered, or maybe it was just the way her mind turned circles around itself, weaving between the thrill of the night and the whispers of questions it left behind. Mika couldn't decide if what she felt was the glow of adventure or the tug of guilt that came in waves, gnawing like an old habit. The day passed in fragments. A shower that didn't wash the night off her skin, a text from Tara checking in with emojis that giggled across her screen. Mika replied with a thumbs up, fingers hovering over the keyboard as she debated telling her about Alex. In the end, she didn't. Days turned into a week, and Mika kept expecting to feel different, more settled in the memory. But each time she replayed the night, she felt something shift inside her, a question that wouldn't be silenced. It wasn't regret, exactly. It was more the feeling of a song ending too soon, when the final note hangs in the air and leaves you wanting it to go on just a bit longer. The next Saturday, she found herself walking by the bar they'd met at, her eyes scanning the rooftop as if she could catch a glimpse of the past. A shadow of a smile played on her lips when she saw Alex leaning over the railing, a drink in his hand and another story in his eyes, this time shared with someone else. Mika's heart twisted, not with jealousy, but with the strange, clear realization that this was the nature of nights like theirs. Temporary, like street art washed away by the rain. She could chase them, taste them, but holding on to them was like cupping water in her hands. She turned away, the city stretching ahead, its lights bright and full of promises that could only last until morning. The air was thick with summer heat, and the annual neighborhood barbecue hummed with chatter and the sizzle of charcoal grills. It was one of those evenings when laughter melted into the golden hour, blurring the boundary between daylight and dusk. I had just returned from university, eager to soak in the familiar. The porch creaked as I leaned on the railing, half listening to my childhood friends argue about whose burger was most charred. Mrs. Gardner, Eric's mom, appeared in the doorway behind me. "Hey, can you help me with these?" She gestured to 2 pitchers of lemonade. I nodded, taking one from her hands. She was in her early 50s, but time had treated her kindly. The warm light caught in her blonde hair, which was now more silver but still fell in effortless waves. "Thanks, Daniel," she said, her smile deepening the laugh lines around her eyes. I followed her inside, the sounds of the barbecue muffled as the door clicked shut behind us. "I haven't seen you much since you came back," she said, setting her pitcher down. Her voice was casual, but there was something in her glance that seemed to linger. "You've been catching up with everyone. It's strange being back after a year," I admitted, trying not to sound like the awkward 19-year-old that I was. "College suits you," she replied. Her eyes, a shade of blue that had seen plenty, swept over me briefly before she started rearranging glasses on the counter. I coughed, suddenly conscious of how narrow the kitchen felt. "Well, I haven't caught up with everyone yet," I joked, trying to dissolve whatever this tension was with humor. She chuckled softly, a sound I didn't think I'd remember hearing, but did. "Would you mind taking this tray out?" She handed me a platter of carefully arranged fruit, fingers brushing mine. I flinched at the electricity of it, pretending to inspect the arrangement too closely, as if strawberries suddenly warranted my deepest attention. The moment shattered when Eric burst through the back door, followed by a gust of laughter and the heavy thump of someone wrestling on the grass. "You're missing out," he yelled, oblivious to the odd silence that fell between me and his mother. "On my way," I muttered, balancing the tray in my palms and stepping out before the room could draw me back in. The night ebbed and flowed with stories, the clink of beer bottles and lazy sparklers waved by the youngest attendees. I tried to catch her in conversation, failed, and told myself I was imagining things. But when most of the neighbors had trickled home and only a few stragglers remained, Mrs. Gardner approached me by the fence, a glass of wine in her hand. "You're staying for a while, I hope?" she asked, swaying slightly. Her voice was different, almost conspiratorial. "Just until the summer ends," I said. Our eyes met, and something passed between us, unmistakable now. Before I could say more, Eric stumbled over, mock drunk on soda and bravado, breaking whatever it was that held us both suspended. The moment splintered like dry wood, and soon I was saying goodbyes, cycling home under a sky littered with stars. That night, sleep was a far-off shore I couldn't reach. I stared at my ceiling, listening to the cicadas sing outside, replaying every glance and word exchanged. By the time I drifted off, the memory of her laugh, tangled with the warm scent of summer, left a heat that refused to fade. Over the following weeks, my visits to Eric's house were more frequent. Excuses built on flimsy reasons. Borrowing books, helping with yard work. Eric never seemed to notice, too caught up in planning beach trips or talking about his internship. But she noticed. I saw it in the way her eyes caught mine when Eric's back was turned, the subtle tap of her foot when we were in the same room. One evening, the sky was split with lightning, and rain slashed sideways. Eric had canceled plans due to the storm, but Mrs. Gardner texted me, "Come over. I need help moving the patio furniture inside." Water ran in rivulets down my back as I knocked on their door. She opened it, hair damp and clinging to her neck, an old t-shirt molding to her frame. We didn't say much, moving chairs and small tables in silence, breaths mingling with the roar of rain and occasional shudder of thunder. When the last chair was stacked, she exhaled and looked at me, the storm outside and something else flaring in her eyes. "You should stay until it lets up," she said, her voice softer than the rain. "I don't mind getting wet," I joked, half laughing. She tilted her head, and the air turned dense. "Daniel," she said, the syllable slow, tasting of something bittersweet. She stepped closer, so close that I could count the freckles on her collarbone. I wasn't sure who leaned in first, only that the first kiss was unsure, tasting of hesitation and rain. The second was certainty. The storm outside felt tame compared to what unraveled in that kitchen. We stumbled, laughter catching in gasps, until we found the narrow hallway that led to her room. The house creaked in protest as we moved, two unmoored ships colliding in a vast sea. When morning leaked its first light into the room, everything stood sharp and real. Sheets tangled at our feet, clothes dropped like forgotten maps leading to where we'd landed. She stirred, eyes opening and finding mine. A silent conversation, a what have we done, but without the dread I expected. Only a tentative, conspiratorial smile. Eric would never know. We both understood this without saying it. As I dressed, she reached for my hand one last time, a tether to that night, a promise held only in glances. And for the rest of that summer, we lived in the space between storms. I woke to the sound of soft rain tapping against the window, each drop like a tiny messenger whispering a different story. My room, cloaked in the early blue of morning, felt colder than usual. I reached out instinctively for my phone, brushing aside the crumpled receipts and half-empty water bottles that cluttered the nightstand. My fingers wrapped around it, and, as if anticipating the worst, I unlocked it with a hesitance I couldn't explain. There was a text, not from the usual chorus of friends or co-workers, but from an unknown number. I clicked it open. Sorry about last night. Hope you got home safe. My heart sank. I didn't recall being anywhere worth a text like that, and my mind started turning over fragments of conversations, blurry memories under neon lights, and the haze of laughter I'd pretended to join. Nothing made sense. I pushed myself up, the room spinning briefly, and wandered to the kitchen, where empty coffee cups were stacked like a testament to sleepless nights. My roommate, Laura, breezed in, fresh from a jog, her blonde ponytail flicking side to side like the tail of a thoroughbred. She caught my eye and raised an eyebrow. "Rough night," she smirked, pouring herself an orange juice. "Nothing that makes sense yet," I muttered, scanning her face for any hint that she might know more than I did. Laura had a way of knowing things, an intuition honed by years of handling people's secrets like they were chess pieces. She leaned against the counter, sipping her drink, eyes assessing me. "Did you and Jake have another fight?" she asked finally. Jake? Even the sound of his name seemed to press like a stone against my chest. We had been dancing on the edge of something I couldn't quite name for weeks, an unnamed, shifting distance. I thought of him last night, the way he sat across from me in the crowded bar, phone screen reflecting off his glasses. The messages he would swipe away, unread but acknowledged with a flicker of guilt that passed over his face too quickly. "We didn't fight," I said, but even to me it sounded defensive. Laura set her glass down with a sigh. "Then maybe it's time for a different conversation, Annie," she said, before pushing off the counter and disappearing down the hall, leaving me alone with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the weight of her words. I found Jake's number in my contacts, thumb hovering over the call button before I opted for a simple text. "We need to talk." It was the kind of message that didn't need an explanation. It was the modern prelude to something serious, the siren that wailed before a storm. Hours ticked by in silence, punctuated only by the tap of rain. My mind replayed images of his smile, that secretive little smirk when he thought I wasn't watching, and the times he'd dodge simple questions with easy charm. It was so easy to forget those moments when he'd hold my hand or laugh until tears welled in his eyes. But now, as afternoon folded into evening, those moments felt staged, rehearsed for an audience that might not have included me. When his reply came, it was direct, almost sterile. "Sure. Come by." I arrived at his apartment, a familiar warmth that now felt foreign. His place was too neat, the kind of clean that suggested he was expecting someone, just not me. Jake stood in the doorway, hair tousled and sleeves rolled up, a domestic image that once would have made me smile. His eyes were shadowed, watching me with a cautious sort of curiosity. "Hey," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. I walked in, noting the subtle changes. the absence of our shared photos on the side table, the perfume that wasn't mine lingering faintly in the air. I turned to him, the questions bubbling up faster than I could shape them. "Who's texting you, Jake? And don't tell me it's work." He looked away, jaw clenching as if the words were iron in his mouth. Silence swelled, stretching the room wide and thin like a rubber band poised to snap. "It's not work," he admitted finally, voice so low I barely heard it. I felt something inside me twist, then harden. "And how long have you been lying to me?" The question felt surgical, cutting straight to the marrow of it. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar I could almost map each strand. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, which wasn't an answer, but an apology wrapped in excuses. I stared at him, waiting for the truth, the real truth, not the vague remorse spilling from his lips. It was then that my phone, still gripped in my shaking hand, buzzed again. Another unknown number, this one saying, "If you ever need to talk, I'm here. You deserve better." A flicker of recognition. A friend who'd been in this place once, who had sat where I now stood, on the brink of losing everything but herself. I looked at Jake, eyes hollow with realization. The years we'd spent, the plans we'd whispered on quiet nights, all unraveling at the seams. And maybe it was that moment, the final snap of a bond too frayed to hold, where I found a strange kind of freedom. "I'm done," I said, and the room seemed to echo it back to me. Jake's eyes widened, something unreadable flashing across his face. But I didn't stay to decode it. I walked out, each step down the hall feeling lighter, the world outside washed clean by the rain and full of stories yet to be told. The steam from the shower fogged up the mirror in Anna's bathroom, curling into the corners and wrapping around the towel rack like smoke. She traced the outline of her face with a finger, leaving a faint, clear path in the condensation. A voice from the hallway snapped her out of her trance. "Anna, you're going to miss the movie if we don't leave soon." Josh's voice carried that playful impatience she knew so well. He had been her best friend since college, the kind of friend who knew when to show up with a box of her favorite cookies after a tough day, or when to turn up the radio and drag her into a stupid dance in the middle of traffic. "Coming," she called back, rushing to throw on an oversized t-shirt and jeans, the scent of lavender soap still clinging to her skin. The movie night had been Josh's idea, an antidote to the stressful week that felt endless. It was something they did often, those platonic rituals that blurred the line between deep friendship and something she didn't dare name. Josh was lounging on the couch, scrolling his phone when she walked in, his dark curls a disheveled mess and his grin boyish. "Finally, I thought I'd have to start without you." "Sure, because going to the movies alone has always been your thing," she teased, shoving him lightly as she grabbed her keys from the bowl by the door. He laughed, and the sound rang out, deep and familiar. It was when they reached the old theater, red brick, neon lights still flickering from a decade past, that Anna felt it, a tug in her chest that she had ignored for years. The line outside was short, locals chatting as they waited for tickets. She paid for both, refusing Josh's faux outrage when he reached for his wallet. "Hey, I'm buying next time then," he said, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Deal," she smiled, pressing the tickets into his hand. They found their seats, the velvet upholstery worn but comfortable. And as the lights dimmed and the screen came alive, Anna felt her heartbeat in her throat. About halfway through the movie, when the soundtrack swelled into something hopeful and triumphant, Josh leaned over, close enough that his breath tickled her ear. "Did you see that twist coming?" he whispered. "Nope," she whispered back, turning slightly, just enough that their eyes met. For a second, the rest of the room seemed to fade, and it was just them in that circle of shared warmth and quiet electricity. He glanced down at her mouth, and she felt a pulse of something too strong, too frightening. The moment broke when the person behind them shushed loudly, making them both jump and laugh quietly, embarrassment tinting their cheeks. But even as the movie continued, Anna's focus wandered, drawn back to the way his hand rested on the armrest between them, fingers drumming an absent rhythm. Without thinking, she placed her hand next to his, close enough that the pinky tips brushed. Neither of them pulled away. After the movie, They walked out into the cool night air, both a little quieter than usual. Josh glanced up at the dark sky, the stars punctuating the endless navy above. "Want to walk a bit?" he asked, nodding towards the park across the street. "Sure," she said, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The park was mostly empty, save for a couple on a bench who sat close, heads bent together like a secret. The path crunched under their shoes as they strolled, silence stretching out, but not uncomfortably so. "I've been thinking," Josh said suddenly, stopping to pick up a fallen leaf and twirl it between his fingers. The street lamp bathed his face in soft light, casting shadows that moved as he did. Anna raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "About us," he admitted, and the air between them shifted, heavy with the unsaid. She felt a chill that wasn't from the wind. "Oh," was all she managed, her voice small. Her mind scrambled to stitch together what was coming, but it was hard to tell if she wanted to stop him or let him finish. "I know we've been friends for, 7 years," he said, half smiling as if counting the days. "And I never wanted to ruin that. But sometimes," he trailed off, his eyes searching hers for some kind of answer, some sign that she wasn't about to run. Anna swallowed, the seconds stretching out until they felt infinite. She wanted to speak, to joke or deflect or anything that would make the moment less real. But then she looked at him, really looked, and saw the same hesitation and hope mirrored there. So she took a step closer, heart thundering as she reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined without resistance, warm and steady. "Sometimes," she said softly, meeting his gaze and feeling the relief that surged when he smiled, eyes bright with something unspoken finally understood. The world around them blurred, the street lamps glow softer now. The city's hum a background chorus to a confession they didn't need words to complete. Neither was sure who leaned in first, only that when they kissed, it was like turning the last page of a book they had been writing together for years. The park held its breath, the quiet moment folding around them as the first drop of rain fell, unnoticed but well. The first time I met Oliver, I thought he was magnetic in that way people sometimes are when they're surrounded by noise. It was a summer party, with fairy lights strung haphazardly through tree branches, laughter rising like smoke from a bonfire. He moved through the crowd with an ease that belied how sharply his eyes assessed everything, from the DJ's playlist to the beer in his hand. When he spoke to me, I felt like the only person in that backyard. He had a way of tilting his head when he listened that made me feel heard, important, chosen. He said he was a writer, the type who scribbled half-drunk poems on the back of receipts and started stories that never saw an ending. It didn't matter that I worked in marketing, a job that bored me to tears and left me feeling worn out and unseen. Around him, I was interesting, even when I didn't know why. The first few weeks with him were like pages ripped from a novel. The kind of story where you could taste the thrill of something just dangerous enough to feel alive, but not yet deadly. We stayed up until dawn arguing about films we'd both pretend we hadn't seen, just so the other could win. He would touch my arm when he disagreed, a gesture that somehow felt both possessive and playful. There was a giddy sort of tension between us, like I had stepped onto a bridge I couldn't see the end of. But the charm had its sharp edges. It began with little things. An eye roll if I said something he deemed uninteresting, a sigh if I mentioned my friend's plans without including him. I brushed it off at first. Everyone has moods, I thought. Besides, who was I to complain when he looked at me with that intensity? Made me feel like every line I spoke was part of a dialogue only we shared. The first time he showed me his darker side, it was over a trivial misunderstanding. A missed text, an unanswered call while I was at the gym. When I saw him, he was already waiting outside my apartment, leaning against the stair rail, eyes dark and unreadable. His greeting was casual enough, but his voice was tight, a taut wire ready to snap. He didn't shout, just made cutting remarks that fell between us like knives. "Do you enjoy making me feel like this?" he whispered, the question lodged deep, heavy in my chest. I apologized reflexively, not even sure what for. Apologies became my mantra, a bridge over the chasm of his moods. "Sorry I forgot. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Sorry, I didn't realize." They were the price for peace, for the moments when he would kiss the top of my head and tell me I was his everything. I drank those moments down like water in a drought, even as the well inside me ran dry. He would stay the night and play the songs we both liked, leaving notes in my kitchen about how perfect mornings felt with me. It was the other side of the pendulum, swinging so sweetly after the bite. The pattern deepened, day by day, until I could feel the tremor in my body before a storm broke. A raised eyebrow could make my heart trip, wondering if I'd done something wrong without knowing. My friends noticed I came out less often, my laughter quiet, like I was saving my breath. I said work was keeping me busy, and I let that be the reason why I started fading out of their weekends and stories. One night, we argued over dinner plans. He wanted to stay in, claiming he felt off, and I had pushed back for once, wanting the simple freedom of a Friday night out. The fight swelled until it was too big for the room. He knocked a chair over, his hand smacking the table so hard the wine glass shuddered and fell, shattering at our feet. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. He stared at the mess, chest rising and falling, then left without saying a word. I spent the next hour sweeping up the shards, careful not to step on any pieces. By the time he came back, the floor was spotless and I was sitting, holding my breath. He sat across from me and took my hands, his fingers cold. "You pushed me, you know that," he said, but it wasn't a question. His eyes were wet, unspilled regret clinging to his lashes. He said he was sorry, that he was afraid of losing me. His voice cracked, and something in me softened, like paper in rain. I pulled him close, as much for him as for myself. But apologies wore thin when the bruises of his words lingered longer than the warmth of his touch. He blamed his temper on the pressure of unfinished stories, the ghosts of dreams that haunted him. I believed him. I wanted to fix it, to be enough to soothe whatever storm churned beneath his skin. Yet, the more I gave, the less I recognized myself in the mirror. The eyes that stared back at me were dull, the light dimmed by the weight of always waiting for the next slip, the next silence heavy with anger. The last time was the worst. We were at a party, another one of those too loud affairs with cheap lights and strangers. He caught me talking to an old friend, someone he didn't know, someone whose presence lit a fuse in him I didn't see until it was too late. He pulled me aside, fingers digging into my wrist. His voice was low, a murmur no one could hear, but the thread in it coiled like a snake. "Do you like embarrassing me?" The air stung as I inhaled too sharply, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The night ended with doors slamming, accusations that stabbed into me until I could barely keep up, my voice hoarse with pleading. When it was over, he stood there spent and shaking. I sank to the floor, cold creeping through my bones, my eyes burning with the knowledge that there was nothing left to salvage. He walked out, leaving me in the silence that felt heavier than anything he could have said. In the end, love wasn't enough to hold back the darkness he carried, and the love I'd held on to so fiercely had become a chain. I didn't watch him walk away that last time. I didn't need to. He was gone before the door even closed, and what was left of me felt like a hollow echo. The bar smelled of damp wood and stale cigarette smoke, the kind that seemed to have soaked into the wallpaper decades before. Ethan sat at the end of the counter, nursing a drink that had long since turned warm. He told himself he was here to meet an old friend, maybe catch up over half-smiles and shared regrets. But the truth was, this place held memories he couldn't let go of. The sign outside still flickered, Charlie's, though everyone who'd been around long enough knew there hadn't been a Charlie here in years. The bartender was a stocky man with a close-cropped beard and eyes that seemed to know every secret anyone had ever whispered in this room. When Ethan looked up, their gazes met, and the bartender nodded as if to say, "I remember too." The door chimed open, and in walked a woman in a black peacoat, her red scarf trailing like a flicker of flame. Leah. Her eyes found him immediately, and she didn't hesitate, moving with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years knowing exactly where she needed to be. She slid into the stool next to him and offered a smile, though it came with a shadow of uncertainty. "Still think they water down the whiskey here?" she asked, breaking the silence that hung between them like a veil. Ethan smirked, the first real smile he'd managed all week. "Pretty sure it's half rainwater by now." Leah laughed, and it sounded almost like it used to, for a moment. They were young again, stumbling through the city with just enough pocket change for a drink and an endless supply of dreams. The years since had been less kind, etched into the lines near her eyes and the calluses on his palms. "How's life been?" he asked, though he didn't know if he really wanted an answer. "Life's well, life," she said, eyes casting down to the glass of gin the bartender had set in front of her without needing to ask. "Freelance work here and there. Keeping busy." He nodded, understanding all that she hadn't said. They both knew what keeping busy meant. They fell into an uneasy silence, filled with the soft clatter of billiard balls in the background and the hum of muffled laughter. It was easier when there were distractions, less room for words that needed saying. He took a sip, winced at the taste, and remembered why he'd stopped coming to this bar in the first place. "Do you ever think about it?" Her voice cut through, sudden and softer than he expected. "About what?" "Leaving this place. Really leaving." She leaned in just slightly, enough that he could smell the sharp tang of winter on her coat. "I dream about it sometimes. A house by the sea. Silence that doesn't feel heavy, you know." Ethan let the idea sit in the space between them, an uninvited guest they both stared at. He didn't know. He dreamed of roads leading away from the city, mornings that didn't begin with alarms or end with aching bones. But dreams, like whiskey, were best savored sparingly. Too much, and they left a bitter taste. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but this place, it has a way of holding you tight." "Yeah." Leah's smile faltered, and she swirled her gin absently. "But maybe we're holding it tighter." He thought about that as the night deepened and the crowd thinned out. They exchanged stories, the kind that grew roots in nostalgia, neither willing to address why they hadn't talked in over a year or how they'd both ended up back at Charlie's. Maybe it didn't matter. The past was a puzzle with pieces they could never quite fit. Just as the clock above the bar clicked toward midnight, a man stepped up to the old upright piano in the corner, fingers cracking like he was about to tell the instrument a secret. The first few notes were tentative, a memory finding its way. The tune, soft and familiar, wrapped around them like an embrace. Ethan glanced at Leah, whose eyes were shining with something unsaid. She reached out, fingers brushing his wrist, tentative and electric. It was like the first time, that evening years ago when a power cut had blanketed the bar in darkness and they danced by the light of strangers' phones. The music picked up tempo, and without a word, she stood, tugging him lightly. "Come on, one last dance." He hesitated, looking around as if expecting laughter or judgment. But no one was paying attention. The room was a blur of motion and warmth, and in this small, pocketed moment, he felt bold. Standing, he joined her in the small, open space between the bar stools and the piano. They swayed, feet shuffling to a rhythm neither could claim as their own, but it didn't matter. The years, the distance, the wrong turns, all of it fell away in the sway of the music. When the song ended, applause scattered through the room, light and amused. Leah's face was close enough that he could see the hope there, fragile and unwavering. "Maybe we don't have to hold it so tight," she whispered. He wanted to say yes, to lean in and kiss away the distance. But the city was a jealous lover, and they both knew it. "I'll think about it," he said, and it was the closest he'd ever come to promising. They left the bar together that night, the cold slicing through the warmth of the shared memory. And as they walked, the city seemed a little softer, the streets whispering of something other than loss. The future was a murky thing, but tonight it felt like a road worth taking, even if only one step at a time. We met when the world seemed like it was caught between chapters. It was the end of college, that stretch where ambition mingled with uncertainty, where plans unfolded in half-hearted promises. Her name was Tara, sharp-witted and impossible to ignore, with a laugh that skidded across rooms and drew eyes. We became friends fast, too fast, some said. She told me about the novel she wanted to write, the essays she buried in private journals. I listened, captivated not just by her stories, but by the way she told them, with a passion that made everything seem brighter. The first time we kissed, it wasn't planned. It was raining, one of those spring storms that drenches the earth without warning. We'd just finished an exhausting study session, hunched over textbooks and crumpled notes in a cafe that smelled of burnt espresso. When we stepped outside, the downpour soaked us in seconds, laughter bubbling up as we darted under a narrow awning. Her hair stuck to her cheeks, mascara smudged just enough to make her look untouchably wild. And then, silence, a pause so intense it drew out the pounding of my heartbeat. I wasn't sure who leaned in first, but the kiss was there, unpracticed, messy real. We didn't talk about it after. Not really. We left it suspended, an unspeakable truth between our shared playlists and stolen glances. Summer came, heat pressing down as we navigated lazy afternoons and nights out that bled into mornings. The kiss stayed there, unaddressed, a secret stitched into the lining of our friendship. One evening, Tara threw a rooftop party in her tiny apartment building. The air smelled of charcoal and jasmine, laughter threading through the conversations. The skyline was a smear of neon and streetlights, and we were kings and queens of our little corner, invincible in that naive way that youth allows. She caught my eye through the crowd, tipping her drink in my direction. I couldn't help but smile. Later, as the party began to dissolve and the sky darkened to ink, she found me sitting at the edge of the roof, legs dangling over the side. She sat down, close enough that our arms brushed. We sat in comfortable quiet until she broke it, her voice low, almost unsure. "You ever think about that night?" I didn't have to ask which night she meant. I nodded, a small sound catching in my throat. "I do," I finally admitted. "Then why haven't we talked about it?" The question landed like a stone. I turned to look at her, the lights from the street glinting in her eyes, full of curiosity and something else. Hope, maybe? The city hummed below us, unaware that for me, this moment would be a dividing line. "We could," I said softly, knowing it meant more than just words. It meant risk, change, the possibility of falling in ways neither of us had prepared for. So we talked, at first in tentative sentences, circling around the truth, then finally diving into it, raw and vulnerable. And when the words ran out, we kissed again, but this time with the knowledge that we were choosing it, choosing each other. The weeks that followed were a montage of quiet revelations and new patterns. Mornings over bagels at the corner deli, her fingers brushing crumbs off my shirt. Nights where stories spilled between us, interwoven with breathless laughter and kisses that deepened into more. It felt like uncharted territory, a beautiful kind of terrifying. But love, real love, isn't just a montage of warm moments. It's the pauses, the misunderstandings that fray tempers, the silences that stretch too long. The first real fight happened in late September, over something small, a forgotten dinner plan, the creeping sense that she was slipping into old habits of distance. Words sharper than intended. A slammed door. I walked the length of our block twice before going back, ready to apologize. But Tara wasn't there. Just a hastily scrawled note. Needed to clear my head. The next days were marked by polite texts, surface-level conversations. I told myself to be patient, to wait for her to come back, to open up again. But a week turned into two, and the space between us became a gulf. I'd see her at gatherings, always surrounded by friends, always with a look that said she was miles away. It hurt in a way I hadn't expected, a dull ache that shadowed everything. One evening, she came by unannounced, looking disheveled and tired. She sat on my couch, knees pulled up to her chest, and after a silence that seemed to last forever, she spoke. "I'm scared," she said, voice cracking, "of how much I feel, of how much I could lose." I reached out, the air thick with unsaid things, fingers brushing hers. "Me too," I whispered, and that was all it took for the distance to collapse. We spent that night in familiar territory, laughing, talking, finding each other again in the spaces between sentences. There were other moments, harder ones. The job that took her across the country, the weeks we spent learning to be apart, the hurried phone calls cut short by exhaustion, the late-night flights where I'd arrive at her door half asleep but completely sure of why I was there. The arguments about whose turn it was to make the next move, who was sacrificing more. But the tether held. We adapted, shaped our lives around this thing that was equal parts fragile and strong. Years later, I found myself standing at the altar, the same stormy sky threatening rain. Tara walked toward me, eyes locked on mine, that same mischievous glint that hadn't dulled with time. The vows were both solemn and ridiculous, full of promises and inside jokes only we understood. When she said, "I choose you," even when the silence feels too loud, I felt a knot in my chest loosen, a deep certainty settling there. The rain finally came, but we laughed as it drenched us, just like that first night so long ago. And as I held her hand, I knew that whatever chapters lay ahead, we'd keep writing them, one uncertain, breathtaking sentence at a time. In the old city that never quite slept, Anna worked at a small bookstore sandwiched between a barbershop and a locksmith. It was the kind of place that smelled like aging paper and faint coffee, where the creak of the floorboards seemed to whisper secrets. Anna loved it there, safe among stories, hiding from the ones she couldn't tell herself. The December air outside was biting, promising snow soon. Through the frosted glass, holiday lights from the streets spilled into the shop, casting glittering, colored shadows on the old, wooden shelves. It was during one of those quiet hours, while she was rearranging a stack of poetry books, that the bell above the door tinkled. She looked up, half expecting the elderly Mr. Hargrove, who always came by to chat and leave with a Hemingway, although he claimed he'd read every book already. Instead, it was a stranger. He stepped in, brushing flakes of snow from his dark, unkempt hair. His eyes were deep, with the kind of haunted look Anna recognized from her own reflection on sleepless nights. He scanned the room with an air of someone searching for more than books. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, voice careful but warm. The shop was her world, and anyone stepping into it was a guest of her heart, at least until proven otherwise. "Actually, I'm looking for a recommendation," he said. There was a hesitation in his voice, as if he wasn't sure she would understand the question behind his question. "What kind?" she replied, wiping her hands on her jeans, her heart taking an inexplicable flutter. He stepped closer, eyes catching on a half-empty cup of tea on the counter. "Something real," he said finally, almost in a whisper. "Something that doesn't lie to you, that doesn't tie everything up neatly with a bow." Anna paused. She thought of her well-worn copy of the bell jar, the way it lay splayed open on her nightstand, pages heavy with ink and grief. But this man needed something else, she sensed. Something braver. "I think I have just the thing," she said, turning and walking to the back of the shop. She pulled out The God of Small Things, its cover faded but proud, a story that knew how to hold pain and beauty in equal measure. He looked at it, then at her, as if trying to read the story behind her eyes. "Thank you," he said, and it sounded like more than just gratitude for the book. He paid with a crumpled bill, fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. There was a spark, or maybe just the static of the winter air. Either way, it made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. He left without saying anything more, and Anna watched him through the window until the crowd swallowed him up. The days rolled on, each one strung with its own set of routines and small surprises. The man, Liam, as she would learn from the signature in the book's return log, didn't come back for weeks. Anna convinced herself she had imagined the way their meeting had left a residue in her mind. But then, on an evening when the snow piled thick and quiet outside, he appeared again, this time with an almost shy smile and a new book in hand, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. They exchanged thoughts, each comment growing a bridge between their evenings and their longings. The visits turned into conversations, then long debates over cups of tea that cooled faster than they drank them. One night, as she was locking up, he lingered, hands buried deep in the pockets of his wool coat. "There's a cafe down the block. Want to get some real coffee?" Anna felt her pulse quicken, a rush of fear and hope intertwining like dancers. She nodded because saying no felt like betraying herself. The cafe was warm, filled with laughter and the sharp hiss of an espresso machine. They talked about cities they'd never been to, childhood games that still haunted their dreams, and the books they would write if only they had the time or courage. Liam laughed, and it filled her chest, sweeping out the cobwebs of sadness that had claimed the corners of her heart. But life is nothing if not capricious. The snowstorm outside grew wild, whipping against the windows with a fury that made their cups rattle. His phone rang, breaking the spell. She caught a glimpse of his expression, a shadow crossing his face like a storm cloud. "I need to take this," he said, standing abruptly. She watched as he stepped into the cold, phone pressed to his ear, the distance between them growing tangible. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The barista began stacking chairs. The warm laughter dimmed. Anna checked her own phone out of nervous habit, the screen showing nothing but old notifications. When Liam returned, his face was unreadable. He sank into the chair opposite hers, eyes cast down. "I need to go," he said, voice tight with something unnamed. "But why?" The question slipped out before she could catch it, exposing the fragile thing she hadn't realized she was carrying. He sighed, eyes meeting hers, heavy with regret and something else she couldn't place. "I wish I could explain, but sometimes life, it doesn't give us the stories we want, just the ones we get." And with that, he stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the tiles. This time, she didn't watch him go because the end of a story is sometimes best left unread. The next morning, the shop opened as usual, the bell tinkling above the door as Mr. Hargrove shuffled in, muttering about how he really ought to start charging rent for all his Hemingway purchases. Anna smiled, the curve of it sad and small. Life resumed in its relentless, indifferent march, the bookstore once again her shelter, filled with endings and new beginnings waiting in between the lines. It started like a song I hadn't heard in years, familiar notes with a melody I couldn't quite place. I was 25, newly moved to the city, with that hopeful mix of ambition and naivety that often leads you into deep, twisting alleyways you'd never expected to wander. He was a friend of a friend, standing at the bar with a grin that held too many promises, each one buried behind dark eyes that sparkled as if they knew secrets no one else did. Our first conversation was brief, the banter easy. He spoke like he was plucking a guitar string, each word vibrating with energy. There was something about the way he listened too that made me feel seen, as if I'd been transparent my whole life until then. It didn't take long before I was hooked on the attention, the compliments that always came laced with a teasing edge. It made me work for it, for him, and work I did, at first without realizing the cost. The cracks appeared subtly, almost artistically so. It started with texts, rapid-fire messages if I didn't reply within a few minutes. "Where are you?" would always be followed by, "Who are you with?" It felt oddly flattering that someone was so invested, and when I mentioned it to friends, they laughed it off, called it passion. I learned to silence my phone during work meetings, the buzz of his possessiveness slipping beneath my skin. It was fine, I told myself. He just cared more than most. The first real fight came 3 months in, over nothing and everything. I was out with coworkers, a harmless dinner that turned into drinks. He showed up uninvited, a storm wrapped in a leather jacket. I still remember how his eyes swept the room, landing on me with a kind of fury that made me drop my fork. He didn't shout, "Not there." He waited until we were outside, the air tense and cold, biting at my skin like a second punishment. "You think you can just ignore me?" he spat, grabbing my arm just hard enough that I felt the bruise blooming under my sleeve. The words that followed were a blur, something about loyalty, respect. I whispered apologies into the space between us, already learning the choreography of submission. When he finally released me, he wrapped me in an embrace so suffocating I could only nod against his chest. It was the strangest comfort, the push and pull that began defining our dance. I kept my mouth shut to my friends after that, claiming tiredness when I declined outings. The loneliness settled in, a sticky companion that I learned to carry with me. He would show up unexpectedly at my door with flowers or small gifts, little peace offerings that would bloom in my apartment, reminders that even hurricanes bring rain for the soil. I convinced myself those moments of kindness were real. They had to be, didn't they? I couldn't be the only one drowning in shadows of my own making. It escalated gradually, like a pot that doesn't realize it's boiling until it's too late. He began dictating what I wore, whether it was too revealing or too plain. If I argued, he'd shut me down with a sharp word or a laugh that sliced through my confidence. "You want to make me look like a fool, don't you?" he'd say, and I'd feel the shame curl in my stomach, as if I'd done something wrong by existing in my own skin. The mirror became an enemy, reflecting back the image of someone I didn't recognize, the cracks in her mask too deep to fill. I told myself things would get better. Every time he held my face in his hands after a fight, eyes wide with what looked like guilt, I chose to believe him. "You make me crazy, you know that?" he'd whisper, the accusation brushing my ear like a caress. He'd tell me he didn't mean to, that I brought out the worst in him because he loved me too much. And I nodded, swallowing those words like they were gospel, every part of me desperate to be worthy of that kind of love. I became an expert at covering up both the physical marks and the lies I told myself. Makeup tutorials taught me how to conceal bruises. Sleepless nights taught me how to smile in the spaces where my happiness should have been. The hardest part was the isolation, the way he carved out my life from the inside and replaced it with just him. My world shrank, until it was the size of his anger, his rare laughter, and the silent truce that always followed his storms. One night, after an argument that had ended with a broken lamp and shattered glass embedded in my palm, I finally tried to leave. I grabbed what I could fit in a bag, moving as quietly as if the floor might betray me. But he was there, silhouetted in the doorway, eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't say a word at first, just watched me with a kind of emptiness that chilled my bones. Then, quietly, he said, "You think you're leaving me?" It wasn't a question. The next moments blurred together. A struggle, my voice strangled with panic, his hands closing around my wrists. The edge of the table caught my hip as I stumbled, the pain sharp but distant. I can't tell you what he shouted because it melted into a ringing in my ears, a static that blocked out reason. When it was over, he sat across from me on the floor, breathing hard, eyes wide as if he too didn't understand what had just happened. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "You know I love you." I sat there, pulse hammering, eyes fixed on the red stain spreading on the carpet from my split lip. It wasn't until that moment that I knew, with a certainty that felt like lead in my veins, that he meant every word. He loved me, but that love was a monster with teeth. And in the end, it would devour us both. That morning had the crisp bite of anticipation, hinting at an autumn chill that hadn't quite yet arrived. Sophie wrapped her fingers tighter around her coffee cup, feeling its warmth seep into her palms. She watched the barista work with practiced precision, each flick and swirl of the wrist producing a perfect heart in a sea of caramel brown foam. The cafe hummed with quiet energy, a mix of murmured conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the gentle strum of a guitar filtering through the overhead speakers. Sophie caught sight of herself in the glass reflection, her wind-tousled hair escaping its bun and eyes that hadn't lost their sparkle despite the weariness. It had been a tough week, full of missed connections and almost opportunities that seemed to evaporate just as she reached for them. Still, something in the day felt different, as if a string of fate had begun to tug at her sleeve. The door opened with a soft chime. Sophie glanced up, half out of habit, half out of hope. In walked a man with tousled brown hair and a beaten leather jacket that spoke of many seasons braving the wind. His eyes were a startling blue, bright enough to rival the sky that day, yet they held a hint of mischief. He paused as he scanned the room, then zeroed in on the only open seat left, right beside Sophie. He approached with an air of casual confidence that made Sophie sit up straighter. "Mind if I take this seat?" he asked, his voice carrying a deep, warm resonance. She nodded, a small smile breaking the barrier of polite indifference she'd built. He slid into the chair and set his cup down, the slight clatter mingling with the cafe's background noise. For a while, neither spoke, content to share the companionable silence that fell between strangers. Sophie sipped her latte, feeling the weight of his presence as he thumbed through a well-worn paperback, the title obscured by a coffee-stained corner. Finally, unable to resist her curiosity, she leaned forward. "Good book." He looked up, a faint smirk lifting one corner of his mouth. "It's a classic, but I'm pretending to read it more than anything. People always assume it's impressive." She chuckled, the sound more genuine than she'd felt in days. "Is it working?" "Not with you, apparently," he admitted with mock defeat. A silence passed, this one full of possibility. He extended his hand. "I'm Lucas." "Sophie," she replied, feeling the sudden spark of connection leap between them. Their hands met briefly, a touch that lingered in the space between skin and heartbeat. They talked in fits and starts, the way two people do when they're testing the waters. The minutes turned into an hour, the flow of conversation winding from the mundane. Favorite movies, travel aspirations, to the slightly absurd. He confessed to her about his failed attempts at baking, stories of bread loaves that could double as doorstops. Sophie laughed until tears pricked her eyes, surprised at how easy it was to be in the moment. The cafe had begun to empty out as the sun dropped behind the horizon, casting long fingers of shadow across their table. A pause settled over them, different from the others. Lucas shifted, running a hand through his hair. "Would you like to grab dinner?" he asked, the question as natural, as if they'd known each other for years. Sophie hesitated only for a heartbeat before nodding. "I'd like that." They strolled out into the golden hour, their steps unconsciously matching pace as they walked down the cobbled streets. The conversations continued, peppered with easy laughter and the occasional brush of their arms. They picked a small bistro with twinkling lights strung across the ceiling, its scent of roasted garlic and fresh herbs coaxing them inside. Over plates of pasta, they discovered more shared quirks. Both loved stargazing, but were hopeless at naming constellations. They detested the taste of olives, but adored the idea of martinis. Lucas confessed he'd once tried salsa dancing on a dare and ended up accidentally tossing his partner's shoe across the room. Sophie, for her part, admitted to a childhood obsession with collecting shiny rocks, which she still had in a jar labeled important stuff. By the time their plates were scraped clean and the laughter had dimmed into soft smiles, the world outside seemed wrapped in velvet night. Lucas traced the edge of his glass absent-mindedly, eyes flicking up to meet hers. There was a pause, charged yet fragile. "I almost didn't come in today," he said finally. "I was supposed to go somewhere else, but I'm glad I did." Sophie felt her heart stutter in its familiar rhythm. "Me too," she whispered, the words almost lost between them. Outside, the air was cooler, laced with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. They walked back to the cafe street, now quiet and strewn with evening shadows. When they reached the point where their paths would diverge, Lucas hesitated. "I'd like to see you again," he said, hope edging his voice. "Maybe somewhere where I don't pretend to read Tolstoy?" Sophie laughed softly, a sound that warmed the space between them. "I'd like that." He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and hinted at the moments yet to come. With a lingering glance, he stepped back, letting their parting carry the promise of something more. Sophie watched him disappear down the street, his silhouette outlined by the soft glow of street lamps. She took a deep breath, the night air filling her with a strange, exhilarating certainty. It wasn't fate, she thought. It was timing, openness, and a bit of reckless courage that turned strangers into something else. Something worth staying up all night thinking about. With that thought, she tucked her hands in her pockets and walked home, her steps lighter, a smile pulling at her lips with every one. He walked into my life on a dull Tuesday evening. It wasn't love at first sight. Nothing so romantic as that, but he had a laugh that cut through the hum of the room and eyes that lingered just a second too long. I was balancing a tray of drinks at a friend's gathering, one of those obligatory, half-hearted attempts to get out there again after a long stretch of solitude. When he offered to help, I said no with a polite smile, but his fingers brushed mine anyway, like it was already decided. "I'm Nick," he said, a half-smirk playing on his lips. He was confident in a way that made my pulse flicker, and the next thing I knew, we were sitting on the old couch, knees touching, sharing stories about places we'd never been but planned to see. He talked with a mix of reckless ambition and vulnerability, a combination that made me feel like the world could suddenly be more interesting than I remembered. It was easy to get lost in him. The whirlwind of late-night phone calls, long drives with no destination, the way he cupped my face when he kissed me, as if making sure I was still real. I'd forgotten how intoxicating attention could be, how it could color the ordinary until everything felt like it buzzed with potential. I started waking up earlier just to scroll through messages he'd sent while I slept, silly memes, and midnight musings that made me laugh into my pillow. The first cracks were barely noticeable. He'd tease me about little things, like the way I couldn't remember movie plots or the fact that I always forgot where I parked my car. At first, I joined in, rolling my eyes with a grin and pretending to be annoyed. But slowly, his words sharpened. What began as light jokes shifted into comments that left a sting. "God, you're forgetful," he'd say, tapping his temple like it was a well-worn joke between us. But his smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. I'd laugh weakly, a sound that felt foreign in my own throat, and tell myself I was being too sensitive. After all, relationships were supposed to have their rough patches, weren't they? Then, one evening, after a dinner where nothing I said seemed to be the right thing, he let out an exasperated sigh. "Why do you always have to make things so difficult?" His voice was low, a thread of frustration winding through each syllable. I felt the words lodge in my chest like a rock. "I'm not trying to," I said softly, avoiding his gaze. The tension simmered between us, thick and suffocating, until he pulled me into a half-hearted hug and muttered an apology. I told myself that was enough, that people who were flawed could still be good, that love meant working through it. The apologies became less frequent as the months wore on. He'd say something hurtful, something that left me speechless, then change the subject like it was nothing. My friend started to notice. "You okay?" Claire asked one evening when we met for drinks. Her eyes scanned my face, too perceptive, and I almost crumbled under their weight. "Just tired," I'd say, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. She wasn't convinced, but she let it drop, her brow knitting together like she was tucking away her concern for later. There was always a moment of clarity before the storm, a moment when I'd think, this isn't right. But then he'd do something to pull me back. Buy me a book he knew I'd like, surprise me with a handwritten note tucked into my bag that read, "You make everything better." Those moments were cruel in their sweetness, leaving me clinging to the hope that the worst was behind us. But the storm came. It was during one of our routine arguments, something stupid that shouldn't have mattered. His eyes darkened in a way that made my pulse thrum with a warning I ignored. When he grabbed my arm, the pressure was just enough to make me wince. He noticed and dropped it as if scalded, stepping back and running a hand through his hair, eyes wide. "God, I didn't mean to," he whispered, voice tight with something between guilt and panic. The silence stretched, both of us suspended in that moment. The room seemed to shrink until there was nothing but his ragged breathing and my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I left. I told myself it was just for a night, just to clear my head. Claire opened the door before I'd even knocked, pulling me into a hug that broke something in me. I spent the night on her couch, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down so hard it felt like drowning. His messages buzzed relentlessly on my phone, apologies that sounded hollow even through a screen. Promises that this time would be different. But hadn't I heard them all before? The next morning, I made a choice. It wasn't a grand declaration. There was no dramatic confrontation. I gathered my things, avoiding the photos we'd taken together, the notes scribbled in margins of books he'd lent me. Each step out of that apartment felt like shedding a skin that had grown too tight, too painful to keep wearing. There were days when I felt lost, adrift in the sudden quiet of my own space. The urge to pick up the phone and tell him something trivial, to hear that familiar voice, was almost unbearable. But I didn't. The first time I smiled without thinking of him, I cried with relief. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot. Healing was uneven, marked by nights when I'd sit in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, shaking off memories like shadows that clung too tight. Claire stayed close, never asking too many questions, just sitting beside me as we watched bad TV and laughed at jokes that made no sense. One evening, she turned to me, eyes searching mine, and said, "I'm proud of you." It was simple, but it was everything, because I realized deep down so was I. I learned to love the quiet, to fill it with things that felt like mine. Music that hummed softly through the walls, books stacked by my bed, mornings where I sipped coffee without dread churning my stomach. The parts of me he dimmed started to glow again, cautious at first, then brighter. And one day, when I passed a cafe where we'd once sat for hours, I didn't feel the weight of him. Instead, I felt the sunlight on my face, the sound of laughter spilling from the door, and I knew I was free.